Firstly, I want to thank you all for coming. You just look so eager and keen, and Katherine and I have just been basking in it, actually, so we'll just sit here for a moment and enjoy that before we have to do any work. I particularly want to thank the men in the audience, because I know, that's my husband, and have to shout out to him because he drove me here. But, you know, it's lovely to see you. We love book festivals, women, but it's really lovely to have one or two men sprinkled in the audience, so kia ora and welcome. The format for today, before I introduce Katherine, is so simple. You've done this a million times before, right? So you sit here, you're attentive, you're excited, and you're just soaking it all in. And then towards the end of the hour, I'm going to throw it open and you can ask a couple of questions. And the rules on the questions, let's just be clear, are that they have a question mark at the end of them. So if you want to, talk about your own or your own writing project or any of that sort of exciting stuff, which is really, really fascinating, that's a conversation for another time. So that's the house rules, and let's get to it. I've got to tell you that, so I actually begged Mary Biggs to do this session. I'm going to be completely open about it. I'm not really a fangirl. As someone said to me only this week, you're a natural outsider. That's because I am. It's what journalists are like. You know, we look on the outside and think everybody's shit. But I'm so excited about this author, and she said, speaking about her as if she's an object, that I said to Mary in the middle of the year, if you need to have Katherine Chidgey and I need to do it. So that's where we are today. So Katherine Chidgey's first novel, In a Fishbone Church, was published in 1998 to wide acclaim, winning Best First Book at the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and it was longlisted for the Orange Prize for Fiction in the UK, which is pretty phenomenal for a first novel. Since then, she's published 6 more novels and some children's books as well, and her latest, Pet, which you can't get yet because it's not yet released, but it's out in a couple of weeks' time. And they're a very diverse bunch of books, actually, taken as a whole. But there are some things that are common to all of them. So Katherine's writing is clever, it's subversive, it's compelling. She tells stories of failing marriages, of lost children. Her characters are flawed. I think a lot of them are quite lonely. They're often well-intentioned, though not always. There's themes of deception and self-deception and violence, and now, and I've got to say this would not have been on my bingo card, there is a determined magpie. The last few years have been Katherine's most productive yet. In 2020, she published Remote Sympathy, which is a giant of a book, and I don't mean that in size, it's just that the themes are, truly profound. It's a book set in a concentration camp. If you haven't read it, you need to stick that on your list this weekend. Last year she published the Axeman's Carnival, introducing all of us to Tama, the Magpie internet sensation. And soon, as I said, you can read about the terrifyingly perfect Mrs. Price, the teacher with the special pet. So, please join me in welcoming Katherine Chidgey. So let's talk about output first, because this is pretty amazing, right? So 3 books in less than 3 years, and all of them very different. And the obvious first question is, what happened? Because without, your early years weren't so prodigious.
Thank you, Linda. Good morning, everyone. It's so lovely to be here in this amazing venue. What an absolute jewel you have here. I'm so grateful to be here. I have to say, first of all, the title of our session is More Than a Magpie, and ever since I knew that for the last few months, I've been walking around our house singing the Bee Gees' More Than a Woman, but changed to More Than a Magpie. So my family are very pleased that the day is finally here and are very much hoping that I'll have that out of my system now. I was reasonably prodigious at the start of my career with my first 3 books. They came out in 98, 2000 and 2003. And then I had a 13-year gap where life just turned really awful for a while there. And we were going through infertility and IVF and eventually surrogacy, and it just, it took its toll. So my writing was kind of stopped in its tracks for a while, and then I came back with The Wish Child, which I'd been trying to write those 13 years, and it just kept dying on the page. Until I had a writing residency in Auckland at a place called the Parr Homestead. This was about 7 years into trying to write The Wish Child. And I also wasn't writing on the writing residency. I was doing a lot of research, and I watched a Sky documentary about Germany during World War II, and a historical figure was mentioned, and I won't explain who that figure is because it's the big reveal in the book, but this figure who'd kind of slipped through the cracks of history was mentioned, and I thought, oh, of course, that's the voice who needs to narrate that book. And so that sort of got me started again, and finally I finished that book. And then, I don't know, I turned 50 under our first lockdown, and then we had a few significant bereavements in our family, and all of a sudden it felt like the clock was ticking very, very loudly in my ear. And it sounds quite depressing to say that I became very aware of my own mortality and how much time or how little time we are allotted on this earth. But yeah, I just realised, you have all these stories that you want to tell. You have notes and notes and notes about novels that you want to write, so get cracking. And since then, I have been just working like a demon, really. I'm quite superstitious about it. I feel like it's not something that I've created. That's not really something that's under my control. And so I'm quite worried that it might just stop one day. And therefore, I am really cracking the whip and keeping up this kind of impossible writing schedule and teaching full-time at the University of Waikato and raising our 7-year-old daughter.
Just tell us a little bit about that. What you describe isn't writer's block as so much as just not having the space and time to do the writing. Is that right? Or did it feel like writer's block?
It felt like writer's block, but it was, part of it was just the hideous drugs I was taking when we were going through IVF that made me very, very depressed. That was part of it, and also the fact that the IVF didn't work made me very depressed. So there were, a few different things at play there, but really it just felt like my brain wasn't working. I couldn't concentrate. Yeah.
So does that mean to write you need a kind of, you need a sort of emotional landscape? I mean, do you need to be, it's interesting because I guess if we're non-writers, we sort of imagine, and maybe this is a sort of romantic silly notion, but we kind of imagine it's a little bit like songwriters, right? Like the more unhappy you are, the better the song. I mean, there's some fantastic songs about when people wrote them in the darkest moments, and I think a lot of us think that's the same for authors, but clearly that's not the case for you.
It's something that I try to press upon my creative writing students, that you don't have to have a miserable life to be a writer. By all means, draw on your darkest material, but you don't. It's not a prerequisite. And yeah, it's definitely been the case for me that the more miserable I've been, the less I've been able to write.
Which is great, actually. Because So your last 3 novels, as I said in my opening remarks, have 3 very different settings and 3 very different tones, from the Nazi concentration camp and Remote Sympathy, High Country Farm in Axeman's, and now we're in a sort of 1980s classroom in Pet. Is that is part of that to sort of keep you interested? You're kind of jumping around the kind of emotional and geographical landscape. Is that sort of part of the fun for you, or is it not that conscious?
I don't know that it's that deliberate, but but yeah, it definitely is a big part of it for me. I wrote 2 books set in Nazi Germany, and at the end of Remote Sympathy, so The Wish Child was the one that had taken me 13 years, and then Remote Sympathy took about 3 years all up, including the editing phase. So I'd been sitting with that really quite challenging material for a long time, and I knew that I really wanted to tell those stories that, they'd sprouted, the germ of them had sprouted when I was living in Berlin in the mid-1990s. So they'd been a long time in the making. But when I got to the end of Remote Sympathy, I knew that, okay, now I have that out of my system and I want to do something different. So I wrote a couple of children's books around Remote Sympathy as well, between The Wish Child and Remote Sympathy, and then after Remote Sympathy, just to have a complete change of pace.
Well, let's just go back to that sort of the German phase, if we can call it that. So what drew you to that period? I mean, okay, you had a period living in Berlin, but, it's pretty brave, right, for someone who isn't German and lives so far away to delve into that period of German history.
Yeah, I suppose so. I try not to freak myself out with thinking about questions like, am I allowed to tell this story? Because otherwise I'd probably never write again. I'd find all kinds of reasons that I wasn't permitted to tell that particular story. I've never been a magpie, for instance. So
Thank God.
But it really was from living in Berlin in those years when, I was there in the early 1990s and it was still very much a divided city, and evidence of the war was still so obvious on the landscape, particularly in the former East. A lot of the buildings just had never been repaired. They'd just been left to stand in their bombed state, and there was shrapnel damage on the sides of the walls, and craters in the street, and very often in the news you'd hear a story about a bomb that had been found somewhere when a building was being excavated and it had to be defused. So, all of those things were kind of metaphors for me as a writer, quite rich metaphors, to say that, hey, the past is still with us and it's still very much present and it might blow up in your face at any moment. And I did a university paper with a well-known German historian who had a class for foreign students studying in Berlin on German history, and one of the topics that we did was Buchenwald, and he took us all on a trip to Buchenwald, and we slept overnight there in the former SS quarters, which, is kind of unthinkable and haunted. We didn't sleep very well. But he pointed out the stump of a famous oak tree that was at the centre of the camp, that had been the only tree spared when the prisoners had cleared the hillside of trees to build Buchenwald. And the reason that it was spared was because it was very much attached to the great German writer Goethe, and he was said to have he did walk those hills, and he was said to sit underneath that particular oak tree and compose poetry. And a lot of his plays were performed open air on that hillside. And the good citizens of Weimar, which is the town just at the foot of the hillside, just a stone's throw from where the camp ended up being, were very concerned that this tree should be preserved, but also that the name of the camp should not be Ettisberg, which is the name of the hillside, because Ettisberg is so closely associated with Goethe. They weren't concerned about the camp being there, they just didn't want the name associated with Goethe, so that's why this made-up name Buchenwald, which means beech grove or beech forest, was attached to it. And when I heard that story, and when I saw the geography of the place and realised that this isn't a death camp out in the east somewhere, this is right in the heart of Germany, and right on the hillside above the beloved cultural capital of Germany, Weimar, where German democracy was born and quickly died between the 2 world wars. So that really stuck with me. And that's what informed Remote Sympathy, really, that idea of proximity and distance, geographical proximity, but emotional distance. And that's why I decided to have the chorus of the 1,000 citizens of Weimar in the book speaking as a collective. So these are the people who professed black and blue after the war that they had no idea of the atrocities going on their doorstep. And yet, there are interviews with people who said, oh yes, on particular days when the wind was blowing downhill, we knew not to hang our washing out because it would get covered with ashes, or we knew not to pick our apples off our trees in the garden and eat them because they would taste like ashes. So, that idea of absolute closeness to horror, but also the human ability to turn away from it, fascinated me.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. It's a extraordinary. It's an extraordinary book, and it's an extraordinary theme all the way through that book. Is that just the complexity of human nature, right? Because some of the people in that book are not bad people, but they are able to turn away from truly horrific things.
Yeah, nobody in the book comes out of it squeaky clean.
No.
So the main character is a German doctor of Jewish heritage who, I suppose is the hero of the book. And early in his career, he has invented this machine that he thinks will be able to cure cancer through electrical pulses, and there were real machines like that. But he decides that, after a couple of trials, it's not really working, so he shelves it. Years later, in the 1940s, a German SS officer in Buchenwald, whose wife is dying of cancer, brings Leonard, the doctor, to the camp as a prisoner and strikes up this kind of devil's pact with him that if Leonard saves his wife using his rebuilt machine, then he will spare Leonard and his family. And so the doctor's in this impossible position where he knows that the machine doesn't work, but he needs to pretend that it does, and he needs to kind of count on the placebo effect and his powers of persuasion and hope that the patient survives until the end of the war. So, although Leonard is the hero of the story, he's also a doctor who's taken the Hippocratic Oath and yet is basically experimenting on his patient, when at the same time, behind closed doors in Buchenwald, there are other medical experiments going on. And where does he sit on that kind of spectrum of culpability? And the wife, too, doesn't really know what her husband's job in the camp involves, even though she's living right on the edge of the camp, just sort of screened off by a little patch of trees. The officers lived there in these beautiful, specially built villas. Their children grew up there. And gradually, it kind of, the knowledge dawns on her what is actually happening just through the trees. And I use her cancer as a metaphor to talk about that kind of creeping knowledge. But she chooses to turn away from that knowledge and not to speak out and put her head above the parapet. So she's not free of guilt either.
No, none of them are. The research for a book like that, the reviews of that book were universally positive, but one of the themes that came through the reviews was about the meticulousness of the research. So tell us a little bit about, and we'll come to the Magpie, because there's a lot of research about the Magpie. We'll come to that in a moment, but clearly that's part of this whole process that you enjoy.
I do love it. All those years when I wasn't writing, I became quite obsessed with eBay. I discovered eBay, and I discovered 1920s evening bags and Art Deco jewellery, which are quite small to post from the States. And it was, I just loved the thrill of the chase with finding the next amazing bargain and the kind of the jewel that nobody else recognised for what it was. And I feel the same way about my research for my books. I love the thrill of the chase. I love that I don't know what I don't know. And there will always be a few moments in the research process where I stumble across something, like I did with the narrator of The Wish Child, where suddenly a piece of the puzzle falls into place and I realise that this is the thing I've been searching for all along, even though I didn't know it. and it's thrilling when that happens.
But you kind of have to have your kind of ears open all the time, don't you, for that?
Yeah, you do. You do. I mean, the research for remote sympathy was vast, and I felt a real weight of responsibility to get that exactly right, because even though with The Wish Child I was in Nazi Germany, with remote sympathy I was taking a step into sacred ground, into the inside the perimeter of the concentration camp. And it was interesting, in a lot of the accounts I read that were written by survivors, the ones that were written decades after the fact often had mistakes in them. So for instance, one man who'd been there wrote about the gas chambers at Buchenwald, and there were no gas chambers at Buchenwald. And what he was actually talking about were the de-infestation chambers that all the prisoners' clothes were put into when they arrived. And I saw them, and they do look really sinister. They do look like gas chambers, but they weren't. And so all through the writing of that and the researching for that, I had to bear that in mind, that a lot of the material I was reading wasn't entirely reliable, and I didn't want to make the mistake of including something like that, which opens the door for Holocaust deniers to jump on it and say, well, you've got that wrong, so therefore the whole thing never happened.
Yeah, I mean, we'll come back to this sort of, because I think this is a bit of a theme in your writing. You may think differently, and that's fine, because I'm the reader, you're the writer. But I think that there's a sort of high wire act that you do with some of your writing in terms of the risks that you're prepared to take, because it would be I mean, something like the Holocaust is just a subject about which there's absolutely justifiably a really heightened sensitivity about who has the right to talk about it and whose voices should be amplified, and you must have really wrestled with that, I'm imagining.
I did, and I kind of took to heart the writings of a former Buchenwald prisoner, a Spanish writer called Jorge Sempran, and I use him in the epigraph for the book. But I actually wrote down one of his quotes because it was really special to me, and I thought it might come up and it might be interesting for you to hear. So he wrote, "The truth we experienced is not credible, and this is a fact the Nazis relied upon." And he said, this is where literature begins: narration, artifice, art, what Primo Levi calls a filtered truth. And he makes the argument that, as he says, literature alone is capable of regenerating truth, and that he predicted that it would be the younger generations, and in particular the writers who hadn't witnessed those events, who would be the ones that nurture that regeneration through the artifice of narrative. And he said language contains everything. So I really clung to that as a voice from the past, from Buchenwald, kind of opening that door for me. But I did have the experience of talking to one of the last Buchenwald survivors, a man in Melbourne, and a group of survivors immigrated to Melbourne after the war, and every year they held a celebration of the fact that they'd survived called the Buchenwald Ball. There's a documentary made about them by one of the sons, and so it was amazing to talk to him and to have some of the kind of research questions confirmed. But I also had the experience of talking to 3 groups. One in Auckland at a conference called the Limud Conference, which is a Jewish conference, and I knew that there would be Holocaust survivors in the audience. And then I spoke to 2 groups via Zoom in New York, Jewish groups in New York. And I was quite nervous before all 3 of those events, but all 3 of them were so lovely, and the people were so welcoming and so gracious, and it was really, really affirming to be able to speak to those groups. And also when I was researching remote sympathy, I sent a New Zealand American writer, Cheryl Pearl Sucher, any passages that had anything to do with Judaism at all. So she is the daughter of Auschwitz survivors and has written about growing up as the daughter of survivors, and she was really helpful as well. And you know, said, "I give you my blessing," but then that's only the blessing of one person, and she can't speak for a whole community. So it did feel like a high wire act, but I think you just have to, if you want to tell a particular story, you have to approach it with respect and make sure that you're talking to the people who that story belongs to. You know, there's an example of that in the Axeman's Carnival as well. I came across a beautiful Aboriginal creation story, which is the story of the first dawn. And basically there was no light in the world. The sky was kind of flat to the earth, and all the creatures of the earth, including humans, had to crawl around and slither around on all fours until the magpies had the idea of propping the sky up with sticks and climbing up onto boulders and then onto mountains and propping the sky up with sticks. And when they got the sky high enough, all the blackness flew apart and formed the clouds, and the first dawn happened. And I knew it was another one of those moments when I read that story. I knew, okay, this has to go in the story, because, you know, one of the themes of that book is cleverness pitted against brute strength. And that's what that story seemed to be about, was the cleverness of small creatures and how they can achieve amazing things even though they're not physically powerful. So I kind of narrowed down the particular area in Australia that story seemed to most belong to, and got in touch with an Aboriginal group there and asked them if I could use it in the book, and sent them my retelling of it that's in the book. And again, they were just so lovely. And the woman I was corresponding with said, "I love this retelling so much, can I show it to our board of directors, and can we put it in our newsletter?" So yeah.
How cool is that?
Yeah, it was beautiful, yeah.
Let's talk about this magpie.
Okay.
So this is this thing about the high wire act, right? And Katherine and I had a little conversation this week to introduce ourselves to each other, and I said this to Katherine then. So, you know, a big fan of her books, love her stories, got the blurb on the Axeman's Carnival, and it says the main character's a magpie. And honest to God, like, I just felt sick. And because I thought, oh my God, like, what have you done? And because it is kind of, okay, it's weird, right? But, yeah. I mean, you pull it off brilliantly. It's a fantastic book. I love it just as much as the others. But, like, that's a real... Did you lie in bed and think, is this like a step too far?
I kind of thought, oh, thank God it's not Nazis again.
Yeah, but it happens to be New Zealand's least popular bird.
I know. Well, Tama is out to change all that.
Oh.
No, I didn't really. I was ready for something new, and the story would not leave me alone. I did feel possessed by Tama. I do feel possessed by Tama. I've told the story before, but I'll tell it again, that, you know, I was casting around for who the narrator of my next book would be, and I wanted to go non-human, and I wanted to have an animal that could talk, and for quite a while I was thinking about either a wolf or potentially a dog, because I'd been watching that quite old YouTube clip of the husky that seems to say, "I love you." I thought, well, yeah, doesn't really seem to have the full vocab for a novel. So then I was thinking, well, birds can mimic, and there are lots of minor birds around us up in the Waikato. Maybe I know they can talk if they're trained. So maybe a bird, maybe some kind of parrot. And then I was going to my writing room at home every morning, opening the windows, and the song of the magpies would come flooding in day after day after day. And finally I realised, oh, they're right there. They're calling to me every morning. And they're walking around just like a metre from my desk, just outside the window. So,
did you think about another bird, though?
Briefly about parrots. Budgies really didn't make much of an appearance, but, you know. I'm
sorry, but the budgie would be hilarious, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
The hero budgie. That is a child's book.
Well, there was a family budgie. I realise when I think about it just how kind of ingrained birds are in our family lore. And growing up, there was always the story that my parents would tell about my my dad's father, who had a budgie, and he was trying to get it to count, and forever he would be saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it wouldn't ever respond, until one day my mother's mother, who was very disapproving of the Chidgeys in general because they didn't have much money and they weren't Catholic and they weren't farmers, was visiting on a rare occasion, and the budgie came out with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you silly bugger. I didn't remember that story until after I'd finished the Axeman's Carnival, but I realised, okay, there's another instance of birds in my DNA.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, as soon as I realised that the bird was going to be a magpie, it just fell into place, and it just seemed to make complete sense in terms of thinking about the darkness and the lightness and the black and the white in the book. That it's in some ways a story about, it is a story about domestic violence, and kind of the darkness of the Kiwi male, kind of a disappointed and angry man like Rob, who's the farmer in the story, who's the son of a disappointed and angry man. But that's laced through with quite a lot of humour and lightness. Mm. Yeah. Do
you want to give us a reading from that book?
So this is quite early in the book, where Tama has been rescued. He's fallen from the nest as a chick, and Marnie, who is married to Rob the farmer, rescues him and brings him home. But Rob cannot put up with the bird in the house, and he forces Marnie to take Tama back to the wild and release him back into the wild. And Tama tries to be a bird for a while, but it doesn't really take, and he decides he wants to go back to the human world. And so this is when he's making that decision. There's quite a lot of dialogue in this section with no he said, she said. So you can't see on the page when it goes to a new voice, but I think I will be able to distinguish that for you. So here we go. This is Tama missing the human world and missing Marnie. I'm going home, I told my sister that evening. That was my second mistake. You are home, she said. I'm leaving the pines. She grabbed at my wing, pinned it to the ground with her claws. We are your blood. You belong with your blood. We're teaching you that. All the bird things you should have learned when she took you prisoner. I miss her. What? What? How did our mother die? Death by car. Who kills with cars? Humans. What is she? Human. Our father will die for the shame of it. His last son, learning to live in a house with a human. Death by shame. I don't belong here, and I miss her. You know he'll blame me. He'll pierce my eyes and drink my blood and clean my bones for the shame of it. He loves you. He loves you best. I could scream for him right now, and I could peck out your throat. See, you are bird. I miss her. She loves me. My sister's claws slipped a little. Who will play the leaf game with me? All the leaves are yours. I don't want them. When my eyes opened, I thought her hand was my mother. We have no mother. No, we have no mother. Death by car. Death by car. No more brothers either, who spoke to us from their shells. Death by cold. Death by cold. And you, the last son, leaving the pines to live in a house with a human. But she let go of my wing. At dusk, when the day birds were calling and carolling, and the night birds rehearsed their hollow hoots, and the sheep glimmered in the falling light, and the cherries hung black in black trees, I flew home. Straight to the ledge of the laundry window I flew, and I tapped 3 times on the glass. It still held the shapes of the bird silhouettes they'd fixed there so I would not hurt myself, and I saw another bird in it too, life-size, that tapped when I tapped, but I was quite alone. Again I tapped, and then she came and peered from the unlit room, hair wet and eyes as black cherries. Oh, she said when she saw me, and I heard it through the glass, a soft single note. It's you, isn't it? And through the glass I said what I should have said in the pines. Ma, 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 ma. My first word, my first human word. What? She said. And then, Rob. She opened the window and I repeated it. ma, 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 ma. Did you hear that? Yeah. What did it sound like to you? Like it's asking for its mother. He said my name, Rob. They stared at me and I stared back. That's crazy, he said. So is a bird asking for its mother. Yeah, well, yeah, both scenarios are crazy. I said, crazy, the word a wet cherry skin in my mouth. Holy fucking shit. Don't swear in front of him. Jesus fucking Christ. I stepped from the ledge to the windowsill, from the windowsill to the deep freeze. My right eye saw the gathering night and my left eye saw Marnie, and she was not going to wring my neck or run me down or shoot me or poison me. That was not how houses worked. I threw myself on my back and waited for her to scratch my belly because she loved me. This time we're keeping him, she said. Then she scratched my belly.
It's so sweet, isn't it? Because it's the child who's looking for a mother and the mother who's looking for a child.
That seems to run through all my books.
I know.
Yeah. It's always there in some way or another, that kind of little autobiographical note. Yeah.
It's sweet. So this, Axeman's Carnival's, as I said at the outset, set on a high country farm, and you're not a farmer.
No.
So again, this immersing yourself in this kind of foreign territory. But this time you had a little bit of help closer to home, didn't you, in terms of understanding some of the rhythms of farm life?
I did, yeah. So my husband, Alan, grew up on a high country sheep station. So he was on hand for lots of research questions. And I also had his late mother's diaries from that time. A lot of which were, details about how many loads of laundry she was doing that day. And that she was going off to her spinning class, which is not the gym, it's, spinning the sheep's wool. So there was a lot of that. But there was also a lot about the rhythms of the farming year and just really great details like, when the ground freezes so hard in wintertime that the sheep's hooves clatter across it like it's made of wood. So details like that found their way into the book. And then I have a cousin, a Hawke's Bay sheep farmer, who's also an agricultural journalist, and she was hugely helpful. And I also spoke to 4 or 5 high country Central Otago sheep station farmers as well, who were very gracious and patient with the townie kind of emailing them back to say, so if you have 2 dogs there at the same time, do you have to say the dog's name first when you're doing the dog calls so that that dog knows that it's the call for them? Just details like that I needed to get exactly right. Yeah.
There's a lot of vulnerability in this book, and we'll talk about the domestic violence since you mentioned it in a minute, but, sort of one of the just kind of threads underneath it was just that vulnerability of living a farming life, vulnerable to the weather, to the vagaries of the weather. Goodness knows, like this year, we've all read about that, right? But we haven't most of us haven't experienced it. But also the particular vulnerability of women in those rural properties, those isolated women.
Yeah, I mean, Marnie is absolutely isolated and hasn't told anyone what's going on within the 4 walls of their house, which, her sister and mother live just down the hill on land that's been turned into a cherry orchard. But she keeps the secret from them as well, and that was something that really interested me, that a lot of women who are involved in situations where domestic violence is happening don't talk about it and don't leave. And as outsiders, we might wonder, why? Why don't you just pack your bags and go? And often it's because of their financial situation. Like for someone like Marnie, she couldn't just leave because there's nothing else that she can do in order to survive, to get by in life. And it's also because of the children. And Tama is her child. And she tries to leave, but she can't abandon him to Rob's violence because Rob has a target on Tama's back, and she knows if she leaves, she'll be leaving someone who's even more vulnerable than she is to deal with Rob.
I read it as it was in the same sort of themes, just so differently expressed, but as we saw, as you described earlier about remote sympathy, where, you know, I thought her family lived close by to this terrible situation and probably on a subconscious level knew about it, or even consciously knew about it, but kind of suppressed that down in the same way as the residents next to the concentration camp knew about it, but kind of suppressed it. And it's that theme that I think you play with so skillfully of, you know, sometimes, and actually it's interesting in the world in which we live, because we're all asked so often to live our best lives, think positively, get up every morning, say our affirmations, but that idea of trying to see everything glass half full is such a, there's some danger for a whole lot of people in that way of looking at interactions and relationships.
Yeah, I mean, Marnie's sister Ange, who lives on the cherry orchard, she does know about one incident, and she kind of raises it, but then just lets it slide again. So a person who, you know, perhaps could have been Marnie's saviour isn't. But there's also the fact that Marnie's very aware of not inflaming Rob's anger, because that'll go badly for her. And so she's walking on eggshells, the way that someone in that situation often feels they have to. She knows how much is riding on Rob defending his title as champion axeman at the upcoming Axeman's Carnival. He wants to win the 10th golden axe in a row. The 9 golden axes from previous years hang above the marital bed. And she knows that if he doesn't win that 10th trophy, she'll be the one on the receiving end of his rage. So she's kind of just always trying to maintain the status quo and not inflame him.
Before we go to questions, I want to talk about internet fame, because without giving anything away, Tama becomes an internet sensation. And in real life, Tama is a Twitter sensation. So well, it's not you, obviously. It's Tama. It's tweeting. How's that going for you?
I realised when I was reading through the proofs of the novel that at one point I mentioned Tama's Twitter handle at Tama Magpie, and I thought, I wonder if any reader will go and look on Twitter to see if he's actually there. I suppose he better be there. And so
I've interacted with this fucking bird.
So he talked me into opening an account for him, and he's quite rude.
He is.
He's quite rude to a lot of his followers, and yet they still keep coming back for more. I'm so sorry. I can only apologise. He's quite peeved that I keep being mentioned as the author of the book when
Gutting.
He wrote it. He wrote it.
Gutting.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your views on this rather than his. But, I mean, Twitter's changed. This is sort of not really about the book, but this is just about society at large. But Twitter's changed a lot since Tama first pecked his way in. And Elon Musk has taken it over, and the whole concept of being an internet sensation in the way that you describe in the book has also changed gears. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think Twitter's going to turn up its toes. I just heard on the news, I think yesterday, that Elon Musk is kind of stepping back because I think he's finally read the room and realised that people don't actually like him being as visible as he is. Tama just arrived when it felt like it might all implode, and so he was quite angry about that in a couple of tweets. For me, social media is kind of a blessing and a curse. As an introvert, I love that I can jump on there and have a little bit of kind of social interaction without it being too much, and I can just sort of close the door again when I want to. I love that it can be really collegial for writers, for whom the profession is so solitary. It allows me to kind of talk and moan and whinge to other writers about how our books are going. I love that about it. I love being able to connect with readers, random people on the other side of the world who might have read a book of mine and want to tell me what they think of it. I love that about it. But I also see how cruel it can be and how feral it can be. And, there's an example of that in the book where there's a scene that I won't sort of describe in too much detail where Marnie is in danger, but most of the followers seem most concerned about the bird. And they all want a piece of tama, to the point where they find out where he lives and they turn up at their house and a child kind of plucks a feather from him to take a souvenir. And it's kind of very borderline. There's a fine line between adoring someone online and it turning into something quite dark and cruel. And that fascinates me about social media too.
Well, it's that same thing we've been talking about all morning, isn't it? Is that ability of, actually good people that you might have as friends, or that they might be your neighbours or someone you work with, and you have a perfectly good relationship with them, and then, they can do the most toxic stuff on social media, either under an anonymous handle or sometimes increasingly under their own name.
Yeah.
It's that ability to be two things at once.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's just turn briefly to this, because this is your latest book, which, as I said, it's coming out in a few weeks' time, and it's set in the 80s, and it's about sort of classroom dynamics, really. This would be a very different book if it was written today, wouldn't it? Because there's no social media in this classroom.
There's no social media, yeah. So it's the story of Justine, a 12-year-old girl at a Catholic primary school who comes under the spell of this new, glamorous, charismatic teacher who comes to their school, and all the other girls in her class do as well. So this teacher, she looks like Olivia Newton-John. She's nothing like their mothers. And gradually the story turns darker and darker.
You want to do a reading?
I thought,
do a little
have we
reading.
got time?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's 2
yeah,
minutes.
We definitely. Yeah.
So I'll give you just a little micro taste of it. This is a scene in the classroom where the children are dissecting cow eyes. Justine, who's the narrator, is recovering from a seizure. She has epilepsy, and so she still feels quite groggy and heavy-limbed. And the teacher is Mrs. Price. Justine's best friend is Amy. "All right, people, find a partner," said Mrs. Price, and Amy grabbed my hand and held on tight, too tight. "I don't think I want to do this," she whispered. But already Mrs. Price was handing out the eyes with a soup spoon, and the pairs of children were taking their places at the dissecting trays. I had the feeling I had seen this moment before, the trays, the rows of glittering tools, the dead eyes looking in all directions, my own hand reaching for something sharp. Strange thoughts often followed a seizure. I tried to blink them away. "First of all," said Mrs. Price, "let's trim off what we don't need, all the scraggy bits from around the edges, yes? Use your scissors to snip them free, or your scalpel. These are the remains of the eyelid and the muscles that move the eye." I offered the scissors to Amy, but she shook her head. "Don't be afraid to handle it firmly," said Mrs. Price, walking around the tables. "You'd be surprised how tough it is. Good, Melissa. Good, Leanne." She rested a hand on Leanne's shoulder and watched as she neatly removed the trailing pieces of flesh. Picking up our specimen, I began to cut. I still felt so heavy in my limbs. "Careful to leave the optic nerve," said Mrs. Price. "The little stump at the back. Your cow can't see without it." The eye was slippery under my fingers, like the grapes Amy and I peeled when we played slaves. I thought I could make out some eyelashes. I pushed the scraps to the edge of the tray. "Now look at the cornea. Can you find the cornea? You'll see that it's cloudy blue. This is what happens in death. In life it's clear, like a plastic bag filled with water to let the light through." "Death," said Amy. "Death?" She pushed her thick black plait over her shoulder as if it might touch something dreadful. That's based on dissecting eyes in Form 2 at primary school.
Oh, it totally took me right back to that, actually. It's disgusting. We did frogs, but I remember one girl, this is at Avonside Girls High School, and one girl fainted, which was actually spectacular.
Yeah. I'm vegetarian, and that's probably why, that memory.
Did you ever have a teacher like Mrs. Price?
Yes. Yeah.
I wondered about that.
Yeah, we did.
Were you the pet?
No, she was my sister's teacher, a year ahead of me, but I desperately wanted to be in her class. Yeah.
Yeah, we had one too. I couldn't remember her name as I read that book, but she was so stylish, and actually she took kids to her house.
Yeah.
It's interesting because God knows you couldn't do that now.
It would never happen now, but she did. She used to take select pets round to her house to eat fudge and coconut ice and to listen to Duran Duran, and
It's creepy.
There's a lot of, the reason that I put that eye scene so close to the start of the book is there's a lot of seeing and watching and looking and being watched in the book. Yeah.
Do you genuinely think that people are as dark and vicious as some of your characters?
Yes. You all look lovely.
Well, that's because they're out. Got their best clothes on, here they are. Yeah,
well,
but you really do.
Oh, well, those are the ones you want to write about, aren't they? You don't want to write about someone who's just perfectly lovely and, nothing horrible ever happens, and, they just go through life picking daisies and,
Yeah, but there's a difference, isn't there, between, just sort of having a fictional fantasy of, what would happen if people were really that awful, and actually some little thread of you thinking there are some people that are really that awful. Yeah,
I think we all have that capacity in us. I know when I was writing the 2 Germany novels, a question that was always at the back of my mind was, how would I have acted then?
Totally.
And I can't say that I would have been on the right side of history. Yeah, because when the chips are down and you think, well, it's me or the neighbours, well, then it's probably going to be me.
Yeah. You said this earlier, I should have picked you up on it, but I'm a bit slow because I'm not a morning person. But you said a little earlier the thread of, the child looking for the mother looking for the child is a sort of theme that you come back to time and time again. And at the very outset of our conversation, you mentioned your own struggles to become a mother. You are a mother now, like you've got your child. Is that still an unresolved theme, do you think? Is it something you'll return to?
Yeah, I think it will always be there in my writing.
Yeah.
And sometimes I don't even realise that I've done it until I look back at the work afterwards and say, oh, yeah, there it is again. Yeah.
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 Hard to kind of, well, you're lucky.
Yeah, that's why I'm not staying for the rest of Booktown because, we worked so hard to have Alice that I need to be home for Mother's Day.
Yeah. And how nice is that? So what are you reading at the moment?
So I'm reading a novel by Maggie Shipstead called Great Circle, which is amazing. Like, it's a tome, it's a doorstopper, 600 and something pages. But it's about a fictional 1950s aviatrix who decides to circumnavigate the globe from north to south, which has never been done before. And Maggie Shipstead got the spark for that book when she was in Auckland and saw the statue of Jean Batten at the airport and thought, oh, okay, that's what the next book will be. So that is cool. It's kind of fascinating. And I'm also reading, I've returned to Shirley Jackson, the American writer who kind of skewered 1950s domesticity, and is probably best known for her horror, but I'm reading her memoir, the second volume of her memoir about being a 1950s housewife in America and how kind of stultifying it was. It's called Raising Demons, and the demons are her 4 children.
Yeah, relating. And you have the next book underway.
Yes, I have a pretty complete draft of the next book actually, but there were a few things in it that I thought, I don't really think I'm getting away with that. But maybe I am. I'll give it to Sue Orr and Elizabeth Knox to read and see what they say, and I won't tell them anything about these concerns I have. They'll be virgin readers, and they both came back to me and said, yeah, I don't think you're really getting away with X, Y, Z. Damn it. Okay, so I'm just kind of performing surgery on that at the moment, and then probably in a couple of months I'll send it off to my agent and see what she thinks.
Do you, how do you respond to that sort of criticism?
I go into the deep pit of despair. And think, why did I start this book? It was a terrible idea. So I think that for a few days, and then I just pull my socks up and remind myself of everything I like about the book, and kind of push through climbing yet another mountain when I've just climbed a whole mountain range.
Yeah, it's amazing. start thinking about your questions, because this is my last question before I throw it out to you, but this will be one of the questions that I think some people will be thinking. So you teach writing as well, as you said at the outset, at Massey. And when...
Waikato.
Oh, Waikato, sorry. My mistake. And when you have your class, at the beginning of the year, and you're sort of getting them ready, what do you tell them are the key elements of a great story?
That something has to happen. It can't be all just beautiful description. That readers enjoy bodies moving and moving through a particular landscape. So you have to have moving characters that interact with each other. And you also have to pay close attention to setting. There has to be a stage underneath the feet of the characters that feels real to the reader, and that you evoke in close focus sensory detail so that the reader feels totally drawn into and convinced by that world. And I also tell them to work on voice and to include dialogue, to include direct speech, because lots of new writers don't, and the writing feels quite dead and quite flat without that sense of moving bodies that are also speaking.
Yeah, fantastic advice. All right, questions from you guys? Hands up. Can't believe, yes. So that person at the back, and then this lovely woman at the front. Yeah. Oh no, well yeah, no, we'll have more time. Yeah, but so if you stand up, shout it out.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And so is Tama.
Honestly, that bird. Yes, over here.
Yeah, it's a good question. They do overlap. So I finish the draft and then get it to the point where I send it off to my agent, who sends it off to my publishers. But after that moment where I've kind of released it, I will have started the next book, and then I'll get into the editing process with my editor. So I'm often working on 2 books at once. There was a period last year where somehow I was working on 4, because I had a children's book coming out, and I had, no, it wasn't last year, it was a bit longer than that, when I was finishing off the final edits for Remote Sympathy, and I was writing, I was making some changes to the Axeman's Carnival, and I'd started Pet, and there was the children's book, and that was really just a few too many balls in the air. Yeah. Yeah, and teaching, yeah.
Another question, I think, was there someone? Yes, thank you.
Hi.
Could everyone hear that question from Ruth? Lovely, thanks, Ruth.
Yeah, it is an issue that's kind of at the forefront of literary debate at the moment, and it does feel quite fraught. And what I say to them is kind of what I said earlier in our session, which is that if you feel the burning desire to tell a particular story that isn't really yours, then make sure that you talk to the people whose story it is, and talk to them more than once, and keep going back to them and send them passages from the writing to make sure that you're getting it right. And then be prepared to take whatever flack might come your way once it is published. But I also feel very strongly that writers shouldn't be told you cannot write about that. That is just a no-go area. I think, if that was taken to its logical conclusion, I'd only ever be writing novels about a creative writing lecturer who lives in the Waikato, who has white cats, and that, that's my life. I don't want to be writing about it, and I don't think anyone really wants to read about it. My good friend, the amazing writer Tracy Slaughter, who is the other creative writing lecturer at Waikato, told me about an Australian short story prize that she was going to enter a few months ago, until she got to the box that she had to tick that said, the topic of my story is a topic that I have personally experienced. And you had to kind of make that declaration before you could enter the competition, which seems insane to me. And, you know, the fact is, we often turn our darkest experiences into fiction because we don't want to keep looking that true story in the face. We want to fictionalise it and change it and make it into something that exists on the page as art. But even if we have experienced that thing, we don't necessarily want to publicly say, this is my own experience and I'm happy for the world to know it. You know, that's why we're fiction writers. So that seemed kind of an extraordinary and troubling development to me.
Well, it touches on the point you made earlier, which is sometimes those sort of hard truths are easier for readers to empathise with and digest when they are fictionalised.
Yeah.
Yeah, without a doubt. I've got time for one more question, I think. Oh, I've got time for two more questions, right? You there, and then this gentleman in the front. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the stories do have to take up residence in you, and the characters do have to seem real to you in order for you to write that story successfully. And definitely the Buchenwald material got under my skin and wouldn't leave me alone, you know, from visiting it in the 1990s to conceiving the idea for the book. And I asked Cheryl Pearl-Sucher, actually, should I use Buchenwald or should I create a fictional camp? And she said, no, without hesitation, you have to use Buchenwald. But I visited it again in 2018 when I was researching the book, and you know, walking through that landscape, you cannot help but be affected by it. And I felt very moved by being there, and also very aware that Germany is a country that does look its past directly in the eyes, and that, you know, probably more than we do actually, has made enormous efforts not to let those stories be forgotten. So I corresponded for about 2 years with a man called Harry Stein, who was the chief historian at the Buchenwald Memorial, and he, you know, was able to give me access to the floor plans of the officers' villas and to the furniture that was designed by prisoners for those spaces. And then when I was there, I went to archives and looked at lots of pieces of ephemera, and, you know, the rations book from the kitchens at Buchenwald, and seeing those documents makes it real. So I do feel as if that material is part of me now, and I'm glad that it is, because it is the only way that you can, I think, write convincingly about that. You can't do it at a distance. You know, just to go back to that theme of proximity and distance, you can't do it at a distance. You have to dive in and make it part of you. And yeah, in a much more light-hearted way, I do feel that Tama's inside me now and continuing to speak on Twitter.
Quick question here, and this, thank you.
Hi, Katherine. I'm David. Hi. I was in Berlin all last week, and yes, there was chaos all around Alexanderplatz because they found another bomb, so it's still happening. Also, while I was there, I was thinking of you because of coming here this week. You've written 2 major books on that part of German history. I was wondering why somebody from the bottom of the world, like we come from, has such an interest in one country in Europe that's so many decades.
I did German at secondary school and then majored in it at university, and I stayed for 3 months in Germany when I was 16, and then was in Berlin in the mid-1990s in my mid-20s. And yeah, like I said, just seeing the evidence of the war still very much obvious on the landscape got to me. But also, I think we need to keep looking at that material, because there's some really alarming statistics, for instance, by a Jewish body based in the States called Claims Conference, who are responsible for negotiating reparations to the descendants of Jewish victims of the Nazis. And they did a study in 2020 that showed that young Americans, millennials, 49% of them cannot name a single concentration camp or ghetto, even though there were 40,000 of them in Europe. And that is shocking to me. And that's why I kind of decided, well, I know there's so much material written about World War II, but I think we still need to keep going back to it and putting the stories out there and reminding people about it.
Thanks, Katherine. And interesting, it's kind of, as you're saying that, I'm reflecting that here we are sitting in the Anzac Hall. And the significance of that for this particular community. Look, it's just been, as I knew it would be, a terrific hour, and I've just loved it. So I hope that you all have too. You've been an amazingly lovely, attentive audience, as always, at Booktown, but can you please join me in thanking Katherine Chidgey?